Thanks for being here and there, as it turns out. And we'll just kind of get started here. Spiritual life in a disenchanted world. We're going to do that for 3 weeks. Okay. There we go. Just a real quick thing, if you're joining us online, the first point is if you have tech questions, you're on your own. And then I put sort of. What I mean by that is I can't, like during this talk, if someone says, oh, I'm having trouble doing this, I can't attend to that. But if after tonight you have problems that you think we can address, then email me and we'll address it for next week. It's really important if you're joining us from a distance that you mute your microphone unless you're asking a question. And when you do unmute, we can hear you really well. And then if you don't know the little trick, you can minimize that speaker box so that most of your screen's the PowerPoint, and I'll just be in the little corner. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we are recording these. So that's for somebody to go back and look at. It's also for somebody who couldn't be in the room or online at the same time. So you can always go back and review it. So I just kind of want to put this class in perspective. I kind of think of this as different. We've done biblical topics like Sermon on the Mount and so forth. We've done theological topics like the meaning of the crucifixion. We've done ethical topics like the mystery of evil and suffering. The one I called Saints of Our Time, authors worth reading. Even how to put sermons together, which I parenthetically put very carefully. But I think this is different. It feels to me like a kind of, well, timely word, but a kind of social critique, as I put there, a combination of personal piety and social critique or ethics. And I even wrote a paper on this. The only thing I've written since coming to the church was a paper for the staff to read on this topic, because some of the stuff I was reading, I just needed to get it out of there. And then eventually I thought, hey, let's do it on a Monday night. So here we are. So we're going to jump in, and here's how we're jumping in. What comes to mind when I say the word forest? Anyway.
Trees. Bunch of trees.
Bunch of trees.
Hard to get through.
Hard to get through.
Lost in the woods.
Lost in the woods.
Tranquil.
Sorry?
Tranquil.
Tranquil. Okay, so if you ask people today in the West, and by the West, I mean Europe, States, etc. If you ask people what comes to mind with forest, those are the things you're going to hear, and a longer list, right? You're going to hear stuff about ecology and caring for the world, etc. But that's what you're going to hear. If you'd asked that question 500 years ago, you would get an entirely different range of answers, including Teresa's Lost in the Woods, but in perhaps a different way than maybe she meant it. 500 years ago, when you said the word forest, people pictured a place of danger. This is where robberies took place, but it was also a place where fairies and spirits lived. Some of the images like this of kind of a fairy tale notion, or even this one, where do all those Grimm's fairy tales go? Where does the Wicked Witch live? Where does Hansel and Gretel get put in the oven? It's in the forest. It's in the place of danger. It's a place of enchantment. But nowadays, 500 years later, see what?
Wavy roof.
Sorry?
Maybe someone in the waiting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's hard to hear with all this going on. Welcome. Grab a chair, hopefully find one. But 500 years later, instead of thinking about enchantment and fairies and demons and robbers and all that stuff, we picture forest rangers. We think about the environment, caring for the world. So it raises a question that Charles Taylor raised in his huge magnum opus, Secular Age. Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God? And you could add all those other things we were just saying, fairies and demons and monsters, etc. Keep admitting people to the waiting room. I feel like a doctor. I don't want to keep them waiting, right? So why was it impossible? I can't go backwards for some reason.
It was.
Yeah, why was it impossible not to believe in God, but now it's almost impossible to believe in God? That's the question that Taylor raises. So here's just a little brief intro question for us. Augustine and Pascal supposedly both said there's a God-shaped hole in the life of every person. Maybe you've heard that line before. So one question for us to just kind of reflect on up front is, do you agree with that notion? Are we made for God? Is God just one option among others? Is there such a thing? I read this just this week in the Christian Century. Is there such a thing as an innate spirituality? Or in other words, real simple, do we learn to be religious, or is that part of our makeup? What do you think? I mean, I'll just say this up front. There's no way to know the answer to this, but what's your thought on it?
You have to be taught.
You think you have to be taught?
Or you have to define religious.
Okay, what would you be your?
I don't know, are you talking Muhammad, are you talking Buddha, are you talking Christian?
Well,
I mean, all these
typically-
things are out there,
Right.
and
Typically,
they aren't all compatible.
religious would mean in this sense that you assign to some deity a higher good, higher power, you assign purpose, you have an inclination toward some kind of worship.
What's referred to as a whole in the life of every man, I think of the basic questions of where did I come from, why am I here, where am I going?
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's in us.
You think it's in us? Yeah, yeah, I mean, my hunch is if we all took out a piece of paper and wrote down, I don't know if we'd be split, but we'd say, some of us would say, I think we may have learned that. And others of us would say, no, it's God-given, right? Okay, so, but that's not Taylor's question. It is his question, but it's not his ultimate question. Here's his big question. How did we go from a world that 500 years ago thought of forests as enchanted to a world that no longer thinks that way? It thinks about the cost of lumber nowadays, right? If you're building a home, you know this is the cost of lumber. So how did a forest go from a magical place to caring for the environment or the cost of lumber? How did we get from disenchanted or enchanted to disenchanted world?
Scientific knowledge.
The age of reason.
Okay, these are good. These are good. It's part of it. You're going to be surprised though at one other part of the answer. So here's what we're going to do. I'm using a forest sort of metaphor here. We're going to do a map of the forest. So today we're going to do bearings. Where are we? How did we get here? Next week, topography. What's the lay of the land? What is it like to live in this disenchanted world? And then the third one, compass, where are we headed? How do we get here? And I should probably just tell you that the people who write about this are really good at 1 and 2. They're not so good when it gets to 3. So they write a book this big, and 99% of it's about 1 and 2. And 3, they go, it's hard to say exactly. So we're stretching when we think about where do we go from here? Is there any hope for turning things around, et cetera? Okay, so how did we get here? 500 years ago, this is before most of you were born, right? 500 years ago, here we go. Just a few highlights. Worshippers were sneaking the host, that's the name for the bread of communion, out of the mass to cure their sick cows, and some of them put it in the ground to help their crops grow. You ever heard that before? It's one of the reasons why in Catholic tradition, the notion of the priest putting it on your tongue and showing it in your mouth comes from. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. The wine of communion was imbued with power of its own. It had a power, and spilling it could kill you if you spilled a drop. They thought that. In fact, probably before the Reformation, most people did not take the cup. They took the bread, and if they took the cup, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Very, very scared. I mean, you're drinking blood, and there was a lot of superstition about what could happen to you. The world was created by God. It was an enchanted place like Eden, albeit with thorns. So the world was this great place where God was walking among us. But it's not to say that the forest didn't have its demons, its fairies, its monsters, etc. So very enchanted world, both in the good sense, good spirits, but also the evil spirits, right? This is everywhere you go, every breath you take, they thought that way. Priests possessed a kind of white magic, in contrast to that in forests, right? So the phrase hocus pocus, you know that one, right? If you were a kid doing magic shows with your parents and your neighbors, is actually a corruption of the phrase, this is the body of Christ. This is what ministers say when they're at the table, right? I said it yesterday. And on the night which he was betrayed, he said, this is my body. Well, that is in Latin, hoc est corpus, which got translated into hocus pocus. And the idea was, well, the priest mumbles a bunch of hocus pocus, and somehow this bread becomes the body, and somehow this wine becomes blood. This was their view, though. 500 years later, okay, you got to fasten your seatbelt. Not just the Enlightenment, because several people said science, progress, civilization, etc., but the Reformation actually made a huge difference in this. So this, is the movement where Martin Luther, the Catholic monk, he's trying to reform his beloved Catholic Church. He's not trying to start Lutheranism. He's not trying to start a movement. He's just trying to reform. And this is a good thing. We wouldn't probably be here. At least we wouldn't be here in the same way. We wouldn't be Protestant, etc. But there was a downside to the Reformation. And not just for Catholics. So for instance, one of the things they were trying to do as a movement was to correct for this two-tier system, that you had clergy and you had laity. One of them was imbued with power and special, and the rest of you peons, right? Well, everybody has access. Everybody can be able to read scripture on their own. Everybody has access to God. Okay? That sounds like a positive, but think about it. Now, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, right? The Oz scene. Well, he's not so magical, is he? So you start to have this
It was
question.
convenient that the printing press was invented at the same time as
Yes,
Martin Luther.
yes, the printing press did, well, it was as powerful as anything. Nothing coming out of the Reformation, nothing would be any more sacred than anything else. That's good news and bad news. If nothing could be more sacred than anything else, that meant everything was sacred, but it also meant everything was secular at the same time. And because this world matters, not just the next one could matter less. Christianity was not just about the next world. Clergy without powers, no longer the man behind the curtain who could do all this magic stuff. Well, now would become, slowly over time, would become the answer person or the educated person, the parson of the village. Think about illiteracy rates. Parson would be the one person in town who was guaranteed to be literate, could read, could write. And without demons in the forest, we now pay to see horror movies and visit haunted houses. This is really interesting. So I went into Home Depot Saturday to get something in the outdoor department, but I had to go through the Halloween section, which I'm pretty sure they put up starting in May or something. But now you pay $200 for a robot monster on your yard that's 25 feet tall. We are paying for what people used to cower going into the woods. They knew about magic, but what critics are saying is because we no longer have that, we now pay for it. And then one of my favorites, cathedrals that were once full of worshipers could be transformed into boutique restaurants. So Charles Taylor that I mentioned is a Canadian philosopher, but another Canadian theologian, John Douglas Hall, says that, and this was 10 years ago, he wrote that there were at the time in Montreal 50 cathedrals for sale on the market, transformed into restaurants, shops, flats or lofts, these kinds of things. So we've come a long way. I don't know if we can say a long way in the right way. So let's think for a moment about a kind of discussion thing. Okay, so some scholars suggest that with the rise of modernity, religious impulses were bound to decline. This is going to happen because religion's a kind of primitive superstition. But others say, no, no, no. It's much more complicated and lots of reasons for the shift. So here's how I feel. I feel dazed and confused when I just think about the two charts, 500 years ago and now. And it feels to me more like 5 million or whatever you want to call it. But what do you make of this shift from what people were like 500 years ago to now? Now, I know 500 years is a long time, but it's not that long. And so I'm just kind of curious, what's your initial take on that?
I think that's
Which it means we get to use our brain instead of just emotion.
So you see that as good.
Absolutely.
What about the downside?
Well, I mean, there is downside, but I think whenever people are really trying to think through an issue, then I think that's a positive.
Right. So clearly that comes from a person who values education. There are,
And who is a disciple's lifelong. I
Yeah.
mean, that makes a difference too.
but you know, the flip side, of course, is there are pockets of Christianity for whom education is the antithesis of religion. And that happened at the same time the disciples were born. You know, we're born in the middle of the 19th century, and that was part of the westward movement. And the westward movement pretty much questioned education, which was valued back east. But in the east, back Boston, Providence, etc., they were really valuing rationalism, and disciples were born in the midst of revivalism. But I just bring that up to say that some of us would say, this is progress, and others would say, this is the worst thing ever happened to Christianity. Yeah, thank you.
But one of the things I think about when you know, what Marita said, there is value in education, but the idea that we're too busy, too externally connected, that's not new. If you go back and read anecdotal information from the 1800s, people were talking about, you know, with the advent of the printing press, nobody listens to the pastor. They read it, they interpret it. So I think that there is good and bad, and I think I feel dazed and confused constantly. You're not alone in that. And I believe that we always, as a society, we strive to be more, to have more, to do more. And I think that education doesn't always give you the ability to be reflective. Sometimes if people choose to be reflective with their education, it does. And so I see it as a real dichotomy between, I certainly believe that I should be able to read the Bible and make my own decisions. But do I make those decisions about what's said based on my existence from, you know, 60 years ago until now, or do I base it on that tracing of history through history? And I think that's what we miss. And I think that that's always why I find these classes so revelatory, because I miss things and I don't know some of the things that happened. And so I think we all have a tendency when we become more independent to be less reflective. Not everyone, every moment, but there is that potential to be less reflective.
I was surprised with the comment that you said that after the Reformation, nothing could be more sacred or less sacred because you didn't have the clergy there to say what was sacred. But I mean, there were church leaders that were not Catholic clergy, Eastern or Western, that wrote and, studied scripture and conveyed that. So did that not have any relevance at all in terms of trying to define what was sacred for the people?
Well, they were trying to say, the movement was trying to say that everything is sacred and is open and accessible to everybody. But the downside of it being accessible to everybody is the magic kind of has worn off. If I don't need a priest to help me interpret this, that's good news. I have access to this. But if anybody can understand it, then over time, the downside was, they didn't realize at the time what the downside was. That what had been a special book that everybody could get to, well, if everybody could get to it, maybe it's not that special anymore.
Except in a lot of cases, it became very special.
Sorry?
So except in a lot of cases, it became very special to the detriment of all other ideas.
Sure.
It's kind of like if you know all the tricks that the magician is doing, it's not much fun anymore.
Yeah.
But see, I would say that an adult type of faith doesn't require magical thinking. And so for
Yeah.
me, getting rid of the magic is nothing but good.
Right. Okay, we'll keep going because we're touching on all the stuff. All right. So we got to get our vocabulary straight. And trust me, you got to get your vocabulary straight when you read Charles Taylor. What do we mean by secular or sacred, right? He calls it a secular age. Can something be both? And if this age is disenchanted, what does that mean? And what do we mean by living the spiritual life? All right, so here's some vocabulary. First thing I would say about a spiritual life, and this is just one broad observation, is that one way that people have divided the notion of spiritual life is using these terms, fancy terms, apophatic, cataphatic. One's embracing mystery, what we can't know. Marita's not in that camp. Marita's in her head. I'm in my head. I'm cataphatic. Cataphatic says embracing what we can know. So think about the people you know who embrace mystery, willing to live with ambiguity, etc., not that interested in pursuing the little detail. That's the difference just right there. But here's what I would say. Either way, I think it's good to think of the spiritual life in terms of flourishing. That's the word we used in that whole life worth living thing. Spiritual life, person finds ultimate meaning and purpose. Even where the mysteries would remain, it'd still be a person who finds something bigger to live for than themselves. They're not wrapped up in self. Okay, so we kind of know what we mean by spiritual life, but I wanted to at least note what we've already sensed, that not everybody comes at the spiritual life the same way. Okay, so then what about enchanted and disenchanted? All right, so for Taylor and others, an enchanted world, I think 500 years ago, belief in God, inevitable. They don't even think about an alternative. And it's perhaps the default option, but it's where the water we swim in still includes religious impulses, sense of mystery, magic, whatever you want to call it. The disenchanted world, though, and this is a really important nuance, it offers competing narratives and options. Belief in God does not go away. It's just one among many options. Or else we wouldn't be doing this in a church. It didn't go away. It just got added on. And some would say it's an outdated category, though. We can't imagine demons anymore. At least some people can't. Some people can. But there's a lot of people willing to entertain the notion of aliens. So that's a very different worldview than 500 years ago. Enchanted, disenchanted. We'll come back to that. This one's really hard. What's the difference between sacred and secular? You could spend hours on this. Whole books are written on it. Some, this is just simple way of looking at it. Some view them as constructs. What is a construct? That's something we made. We came up with this idea. It may not have existed, but this is one way we thought of the world. So on one side would be the sacred, or you want to call it the holy, and on the other side would be the secular or material. So communion, sacred. Oreos, secular. Personally, I think Oreos are pretty simple. But you
And
get
Oreos at communion. I
I
mean,
mean-
you know.
dipped in milk for 3 seconds. Some say, no. They view them as separate categories. Sacred is used for special religious use, and secular or profane, by the way, the word profane means outside of the temple. Literally means outside of the temple. You can hear it kind of pro in front of. So for common objects, so objects in the temple, if it's inside the temple, it's going to be sacred. If it's outside, same cup in the temple, sacred. Outside, secular. And then others say, no. Sacred, secular are distinct categories, but separate, so on another axis than categories like pure and impure. So you could have an ordinary drink cups outside the temple, and it could become impure, or it could be purified. Same thing for the object inside the temple. It's sacred inside the temple, but it could be made impure by contact with something that's unclean, needed to be clean. Okay, all of that to say, here's Taylor's definition. He's giving you 3 of them. Secular one was used in medieval times. This is how people used to use the term. It was to contrast the priestly work from that of the baker and the candlestick maker. So bread and wax, that's secular. But it could be used for sacred purpose, right? They could make candles for church. They could make bread for communion. But if you were sewing rugs, you didn't have sacred work. You had secular work. If you were doing baptism, you had sacred work. So that's how they thought of the world at the time. After the Enlightenment, secular too, it's been used mostly to distinguish neutral or non-sectarian from religious. So for instance, if your kids go to Catholic school, they go to a religious school. If your kids go to public school, that's secular. And you can kind of think through some arguments that people have along these lines about prayer in schools and things. But here's where Taylor's focusing, secular 3. He uses that to describe a society where belief in God is one option among many. Remember what we said about a disenchanted world. Belief in God is still an option. It's just one of many. So look at the note there. A secular 3 society, pretty much what we live in, it can undergo religious revival or decline because it's one option among many. But the water we swim in, the air we breathe, whatever you want to call it, is largely disenchanted. And by the way, he just calls the water we swim in a social imaginary. I think the way to think of it is this: the stories we tell ourselves as a culture. In literature, in movies, television, novels, commercials, commercials are always preaching the meta-narratives of a people. Okay, so Jamie Smith, thankfully, wrote a little book tackling this big book. And he, at one point, says, imagine you see the bees there, Brooklyn, Berkeley, and Boulder, liberal bastions, and I added Brookside. So he writes of the secular lives many people are leading, and this is what he says. In many ways, these secular people, secular 3 people, they've constructed webs of meaning that provide almost all the significance they need in their lives. And I met just such a person the other day. I said, so why are you, and he kind of flip-flop back and forth between atheist and agnostic. Why are you like that? Because I have everything I need. I don't need God. And this person wasn't denying the existence of a God because he's kind of secular 3. He would say, yeah, that's an option. I mean, you can have that one. And so, this is where he lives. But this is what Smith adds. A lot hinges on the almost. You hear it? They have everything they need. Well, almost everything they need. There is a longing. Some people are claiming there is a longing that no matter how secular 3 you are, there is still a kind of Christ-haunted absence, the God-shaped hole, whatever. And again, that's an argument, it's not provable. So that other term then is actually what he calls cross-pressured, or I call it the complicated middle. Don't you like those Chuck Taylors there at the bottom? I thought it was appropriate since he's Charles Taylor, you know? I don't think he's the Taylor. So we live between religious and secular three impulses. We don't have a choice. So here's some examples. The cathedrals that are mostly empty of worshipers are still desirable for weddings. This alone is a point worth contemplating. We have people almost every week, but certainly once a month. Young couple visiting, want to get married here. That's why they're visiting, to kind of gawk at it. And you can talk to them and say, so what's your story? And eventually you find out there's no religious impulse whatsoever. And that's who they are. That's not, you know, an indictment. But you kind of wonder, well, why do you want to get married here?
Because of the pictures. They always see that. I've heard that driving down Ward Parkway. They always have that. Such a nice church, they want to get married there.
Sure.
Because it's
The atmosphere.
Yeah. But isn't that an interesting thing for a person with no religious impulse? So Taylor says his theories out there, they may not think they have a religious impulse, but they do. It's just way, way down in there. It's the God-shaped hole. And somehow stepping into this place to say, I do, in this place, it's an echo of Eden. Second point, we now long for what we also doubt is true. So, for instance, notice I put Thomas, not Mars Hill. So Mars Hill is a story in Acts chapter 17, where Paul goes to Athens. They're on the hill, and these are all the philosophers, and they have all these deities, and they're really interested in just new things. They just love to hear speakers come and talk about something they've never thought about. And so Paul uses this opportunity to say, well, you know, you worship all these deities. Let me tell you about the one true God. Well, some people have used Mars Hill. It's a common term in some pockets of Christianity to be a way to reach people who are longing for something religious. But what Smith and Taylor and others say is, well, yeah, that was a polytheistic kind of worldview, but what if just theism, religion, is just one option among many? Well, then maybe it's more like we're like Thomas, who, you know, issues this confession, this Easter confession, my Lord, my God, but also is the one who says, well, unless I touch, unless I put my hand there, that we're in a position of, we believe things that we also maybe doubt. Like, I know a lot of preachers around Easter time that say, well, I got to preach the resurrection, but I'm not totally sure I believe it. Or whatever. Spirituality becomes a matter of choice. You like kale?
No.
Prayer, yoga, Bible, cycling, soccer, gardening. What are you into? You know, we
You
got.
didn't put golf up there?
I should have.
That wasn't fair.
That is, you get a gold star for that. But yes, you should come see the picture in my office.
Well, that's because that's the secret.
Yeah, that's sacred 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, it's really interesting though, the spirituality aspect of so many people now. This is that cross-pressure kind of life. This is an interesting one. The minister's announcement of coffee and forgiveness equal in value. So here's the context. 500 years ago, the minister said, your sins are forgiven. It's a priestly act to pronounce forgiveness of sins. Of course, the reformers were like, who are you to tell me that, right? But these words spoken by the minister, the priest, they were powerful. They unleashed forgiveness. That's why they started selling called indulgences, right? I mean, it's a very abusive situation. Well, 500 years later, the minister can say that on a Sunday, but the same minister used her voice box a few minutes ago to say, oh, please join us for coffee in the parlor. And, coffee, forgiveness, yeah, sure. One of those maybe has more power than the other. It could be coffee.
Because coffee's community, and community is a significant.
Sure,
piece of it.
sure. Here's a phrase that is actually used to describe, sometimes used to describe New England, but I think it fits the secular age. We've become children of a superstitious mother and a philosopher father. That's the cross pressure. We have this thinking, but we have these kind of religious impulses, Sunday school lesson back there as a child, whatever it is. I mean, when I'm on a golf course and I get paired up with somebody and they find out what I do, and they'll say, I went to church when I was 3. I remember we glued cotton balls on and talked about God was a shepherd and that's their religious education. But you start talking about, I don't know, the space shuttle or whatever, the space station. I mean, that's their worldview. And this others, but there's some cross pressure there. And then I think this is a really important point. The new atheists, these are the people who are writing and trying very much to kind of poke holes in religion and kill off God and the whole notion of that. They refuse to acknowledge any enchantment. They just don't want to have an enchanted world. Fundamentalists, and I'm just using that as an umbrella term for ultra-conservative, I think there's actually a little distinction. They pretend or want to pretend that all is well. But what if both of those positions need nuancing, which again would be cross pressure, right? Okay, so here's what Taylor says happened. We didn't subtract, we added. So in the example I use here is religious people battling or battling secular too, right? They're taking on the secular world. They're going to note things like we took away prayer in school. And that's a secular two mentality. But that's not what Taylor's thinking about. He's thinking about secular 3 where we're cross pressure. And he says it's what we added to the mix. It's not what we took away. We didn't take away people's Bibles. They still, you can have them. But, while you're on Amazon, if you want to get a Bible, sure, but you could get, whatever the book is, right? There's, I don't know, 100 billion titles on there or something. So here's the 3 that he names. To a world of magical things, like forests and fairies, bread and wine, we added an informed mind. What we can now know scientifically, thus we're enlightened. We know there's no fairies in the forest. Well, say we know that. To communal living, heretics, it was really important to prosecute heretics. Why? Because they would bring destruction upon the whole village. They weren't just interested in doctrinal purity. What do I care if you believe this and I believe that? Well, if you have a communal understanding, you think the heretic among us, this is why witches were burned. So they went from communal understanding to the private individual. The story of Augustine, he's in the 5th century, he's found reading silently and everybody's baffled. They had never seen silent reading. It didn't used to exist. The invention of silent reading, reading to oneself, was a very big signal that the world was changing. It's my beliefs. There's no, if I believe that there's no such thing as a Trinity, what difference does that make to you? So we're on our own. Everybody's on their own. Yeah.
The believing that heretics could bring destruction on the whole village, that's still, is it Pat Robertson who thinks that bad things happen because
Sure.
of gay marriage or things
Yeah.
like that?
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
there's still
that.
pockets. Yeah, because that's one way that they read, the Bible, because there is a theology, not the only, there is a theology in the Bible that kind of says that Israel gets punished for their sins and carted off. But that's only one theology. Book of Job has a different theology.
Mike?
Yep.
Matt Thompson wants it.
Oh, he does. Wonder how I get him in. I can't see a thing.
Oh, well, he was there.
Okay.
Maybe.
Didn't make it. Okay, third one, if I can get it to work. There we go. To the cosmos, which was an ordered world created by God, we added the universe, the vast, unknowable, unreachable system of galaxies, and the Earth. Galileo said, it's not at the center, right? He's put on trial. He's found guilty of heresy. So we went from this world that had the world at the center, it's held up by God, and everything revolving around it, to, oh no, it's a solar system, to, well, Hubble telescope and beyond, rovers on Mars. I just keep doing it. Okay, so how does Taylor's description?
Demons, Mike.
What?
Demons.
How does Taylor's description of living cross-pressured lives resonate with you? What does living a spiritual life in a disenchanted world mean? What is about your faith that you both believe and doubt? What does Taylor's notion of addition say to you about our situation? Or anything else that was brought up? Anything that spark your interest?
I think I find myself switching between an enchanted world and a non-enchanted world. It's fun to look at things of beauty and that sort of thing and be enchanted by that, and to think of God's creation and all of those things.
Yeah,
But then when you think about the universe, it's a little harder.
right. Well, like some of you read the Overstory, the novel that's about characters and trees. And it's really brilliant because, for instance, it shows how trees use their root system to connect and send messages down the line that a disease is coming. Okay, scientific mindset says, wow, that's fascinating how that works. The enchanted worldview says, isn't that something? The trees are holding hands under the ground. Well, most of us, we kind of live in that cross-pressured life. When I hurt my back and wasn't sure I was going to get off the couch for 6 weeks and was in such pain, and then I got well. Well, I gave thanks to God, but Pat Griffith, MD, is the one that put the shots in my back. And I'm pretty sure if I hadn't gone to see Pat Griffith, who put 2 shots in my back, I might still be on my back. But at the same time, I gave thanks to God for Pat Griffith's education and took him golfing to thank him. So I feel very cross pressure. I mean, my whole vocation is enchanted. Well, trust me, there are things going behind the scenes. I'm not enchanted, but you get it. And yet I feel like, I'm scientific. I'm child of the Enlightenment.
I don't know that that's such a bad thing to be both. I mean, I think it's okay.
Mhm.
I could see you hitting that shot that you can't believe. It was enchanted.
Anyone else?
I think that, everything in the whole world seems like a continuum on occasion. And so I think living that cross-pressure life resonates with me because I don't want to let go of, that's not even possible. I don't have any intention of allowing others to disenchant me with the notion of God
Hmm.
and purpose
Hmm.
and a life worth living.
Hmm.
And so I think living a spiritual life in a disenchanted world means that I'm striving to bring something of that enchantment,
Hmm.
whether it be in terms of kindness or justice, to the disenchanted. And I think one really interesting thing is that our Life Worth Living group, we have refused to stop meeting.
Yeah, I've heard that.
We meet once a month, and keep in mind, one of our members is in Connecticut.
Mhm.
And I don't, we haven't described these questions, but surely I will talk about these questions with that group, because I think we all feel that pressure, especially because our group is mixed. There's me, I'm old, we have a young family, you know, with two little boys that run in and out of the room. And then we have two people that are kind of in the middle, and then another person that's really young. And I think that we're all holding hands, kind of like those trees, to deal with that cross pressure.
I don't know if this makes sense, but I'll put it as a question. Do you find it more difficult, easier, whatever, whichever way you want to phrase it, to relate to people who have a totally disenchanted world or who have a hyper enchanted world? In other words, who don't live cross pressure. They totally secular or so religious that they deny that there is such a thing as a secular.
Hyper.
Does that make sense? I mean, you know, and how does a church relate to that kind of,
particularly a disciple church.
why do you say particular?
Well, because I think, because we have more, within the structure of the church is not a requirement that you believe a certain way. I think we have people in our church who are pretty on the enchanted side, and
Sure. Yeah, it's true.
I think,
And I have more of an issue with the enchanted type too. But that's okay, because again, I'm a lifelong disciple, and they get to make that decision for themselves, as long as they don't try to convince me that I have the wrong attitude as far as the faith that I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
And that isn't always the case.
All right, so,
Mike, I think for me, the trying to face this disenchanted world alone is what might be difficult for some people, which is why I'm so thankful to have a community in the church that allows me to learn from and listen to other voices in terms of how they're dealing with it. And I think that's just so critical. And I always wonder about people that, you know, say they are atheists or have chosen not to be a member of a church at all. And it seems to me that they are really missing that sense of community for some of life's big questions.
well, some of them would say they have it in their yoga class or their spin class or their Zumba class or their painting class or whatever.
And I wonder if those will be enough when they run up against a real life challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that, I would offer the idea that because we've lived in nothing but peace and prosperity in our lifetimes, we're totally different from the generation of my parents and grandparents who went through World War I, Depression, World War II. They had a whole different view.
Yeah, we clearly are talking about the prosperous contemporary West. This is different, not just a different time, but at different parts of the world. You know, even like theologians dealing with kind of the global aspect of Christianity are talking about, okay, so the cathedrals that are empty in England were followed by empty cathedrals in Canada, and the death of churches in the States. Korea, on the other hand, is having these great revivals, but some say, well, yeah, give them time. This is the next step. They only got to do is look at Europe, Canada, States, and see their future. Who knows? It's hard to say.
In the question, it's asked about leading a spiritual life in a world of disenchantment. How would you broadly define spiritual life?
Well, like I said earlier, you could spend a lot of time. I'm thinking in this case, in this context, in this congregation, with me giving my thoughts to this, I'm thinking about somebody who has religious impulses, Christian impulses, whether Protestant or Catholic, but kind of a, churchly sort of orientation. Could be, could be more broadly defined. I mean, like Tillich and others called it that ultimate concern. They have ultimate concerns. But there are a lot of people who have ultimate concerns for whom religion's not a piece of that framework.
So you would tie it then to a denominational.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how do people who go to Country Club Christian Church, how do they live whatever version of their spirituality they live in a world that's cross-pressured, where Christianity is one option and kale's another. No, I'm not into kale. Oreos, some of the characteristics. More mobility than ever, but with no clear destination. We'll talk about that one. More access to the good life, but to what end? You too, right? I still haven't found what I'm looking for, or you could go with stones. I can't get no satisfaction. A sense of malaise and complacency in general. So when people start naming, especially out of the pandemic, this malaise, a lot of the people who are writing about secular, disenchanted world say, well, this is just a symptom of our times. In a disenchanted world, malaise, complacency, it's very symptomatic. Boredom as the new normal. Some people have said tedium is the name of our newest demon. That's clearly a prosperous Western kind of thing. Technology and the pace of life overwhelm us. I'm giving you a little preview. The next week's focus on the topography is primarily going to focus on technology and pace of life. And it's really interesting that the people who write about this focus there almost exclusively. There's one other area at least that I think could be named, but technology and the pace of life have made a big difference in this. I mean, we've already named some of that. From the printing press, which helped launch that Reformation, the Enlightenment, this spread of information, and then of course you keep going with things like telegraph in which you could be instantly communicating, et cetera. Okay, so I'm not recommending you read this. I started this in 2011, I think it was, something like that. It's a really hard read, but I enjoyed it. But it was slugging along. But two books that I'm not even sure I'd recommend either, but Congregation in the Secular Age and the Smith book, How Not to Be Secular. They're a little more, they're shorter and they're a little more accessible, but they're just kind of heady. For some reason, nobody's interested in writing this for just, anybody to understand. But it's worth, I think if you're going to read one, try Smith. We were going to have him come lecture in the spring, but COVID happened and it all fell through and he's not coming. But I think he's one of the most brilliant thinkers right now in Christian circles. Okay, so what's your main takeaway? What do you think about the discussion next week on technology-based life? Anything else you want to just say about a secular age or a disenchanted world? Is your head spinning or are you like, oh my gosh?
I'm so excited.
You are?
Yes, to be back in this.
Oh,
setting.
yeah, me too.
I mean, to have this kind of discussion, because for me, the idea of having access to a lot of things technologically is not the same as this.
I agree. I
Even
agree.
with this.
And yet, I'm really glad that we've got some folks that are at home and joined it, and hopefully some who can access it later because it's recorded. It'll be posted somewhere in the cloud, and then they'll figure out how to get it down from the cloud.
How many people zoomed in?
I don't know for sure. I think it was half a dozen or so.
I think I'm reading a book called The Booksellers of Florence. And it's interesting because it's all about how the printing press changed things. And these people in 1475 are complaining about the same thing we're complaining about today. Except it's an amazing book about the impact of the printing press versus scribes. And it's interesting that we sound the same.
Yeah, I think what I personally wrestle a lot with is I have 4 children who were raised in this church, and I have 4 children and their families who do not go to church. And I don't know what they're missing. I know what I feel, but I just to be interested to see where they are when they're my age. And what options they will have for them, what they will pursue.
I'm just not sure where we're going with all the disenchantment. Where does this take us exactly? If we are only about education and rationality, and I don't know at the end, it looks like, that worries me.
Yeah.
I think that for me, even though I have knowledge at my beck and call by getting on the internet or whatever, still, I know that there are things that I will never understand. And I know that there are things that will be enchanted for me. And so I think I really like to have things that are enchanted. Not in a negative way, but in a positive way. I think where would we be, where would our poets be, and where would our artists be without enchantment?
And a lot of those things are going the way of the dinosaur.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, how long ago did the population in general read poetry? Less than 100 years ago. How many people read poetry? A lot.
well, how many read?
Well, yeah, how many read? Right. Yeah, well, if you're, thinking that in week 3, we will have answers. Not so much, but we're at least raising the right questions and wrestling with them, which is a start.
Now, in preparing worship services, to me, there has always been an element of mystery or enchantment or as part of the service. There is the rote liturgy and there is the songs we sing, but at some point, some of that time, it rises to a different level, a level that's not analytical, at least to me.
Yeah, well, I think we try very much to have our worship be a blend of rationalism and revivalism. There are moments when we are moved by an Alex, solo or an organ piece or a story that's told. But there are other moments where we contemplate ideas. And since human beings are both rational and emotional, that, is the sweet spot. And Christianity tends to see rationalism, revivalism as true, false, which, it's binary, which one you're going to pick, as opposed to embracing that. You can go places where worship is totally emotional, and you go, not totally, but very much predominantly, and the opposite, where it's predominantly rational and somewhat colder. And people are wired differently, and they find different things meaningful. I've always thought that the sweet spot, though, has the best chance of reaching the whole person as well as the whole lot. It's a challenge, though. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you being here and being online. And, we'll tackle some more next week.